The ambulance bay doors burst open before the wheels stopped rolling. Two paramedics pushed the gurney through the gap, calling out numbers that meant nothing to anyone outside medicine. Blood pressure falling, pulse weak and thin. A young man strapped to the gurney, eyes closed, face the color of old paper. Nurse Maggie Doyle was already moving toward him. Gloves snapped on, eyes locked on the small monitor clipped to the gurney rail. She did not need anyone to explain that this was bad. She had seen bad before. She knew its exact shape, the way some people know a smell from childhood. Car accident on Route 9, one paramedic called out. Internal bleeding, pressure dropping. Dr. Peter Lang, the resident on duty, came around the other side of the gurney. He was good with charts. He was good with patients who answered questions in full sentences. This patient could not answer anything. Bay 3, Lang said, his voice tighter than he meant it to be. Maggie pushed without being told twice. Wheels squealed against the tile floor. A cart of supplies rattled somewhere behind them, and for one strange second her whole attention narrowed down to that single sound, the rattle of metal trays, instead of the dying man under her hands. That was how her mind worked under pressure. It found something small to hold on to while the big thing happened around it. The doors of Bay 3 swung shut behind them. Outside in the corridor, a third paramedic, a young man named Ryan Cole, stood catching his breath against the wall. His hand still shook from the drive-in, from the way the patient's blood pressure had dropped twice in the back of the ambulance, from the radio call he had made asking for a trauma team to be ready before they even arrived. He had seen plenty of accidents on Route 9. This one had been different. The other car involved had barely been scratched. The driver of that car had walked away with a sprained wrist and a story to tell at dinner. The young man on the gurney had not been so lucky. Sometimes it worked that way. Sometimes the damage landed on the one person who least deserved it. Ryan pushed off the wall and went to find a phone, because somewhere in his mind he already understood that whoever this patient's family was, they were about to come through those front doors expecting answers nobody had yet. Inside, the room filled fast. A second nurse arrived. Lang called for blood. Maggie cut away the young man's jacket and found the bruising already spreading dark across his stomach, a bruise with no edges, still growing while she watched it. "He's bleeding somewhere we can't see," she said. Stomach's getting tighter by the minute. Lang nodded, jaw working. He checked the chart the paramedics had handed off. A name, an age, 25, and then, near the bottom of the page, a line that made his hand stop moving for half a second. Next of kin, General Edward Hartley, Captain Daniel Hartley, 25 years old, driving back from base on a road he had probably driven 100 times before. The kind of road that lulls a person into thinking nothing bad happens on familiar ground. Nothing in the chart explained what kind of son he was, what he liked, who waited for him at home. The paper only ever told you the parts that mattered for the next 60 minutes, and right now, that meant a name, an age, and a blood pressure that refused to hold steady. He looked up at Maggie. She had already seen it too. Neither of them said anything about it. There was no time for it to matter yet. Out in the main lobby, the automatic doors slid open, and a man walked through them like he was walking onto a battlefield. 4 stars sat on each shoulder of his uniform, polished and unmistakable. 2 aides followed a step behind him, both of them already on their phones, both of them already failing to keep up. One of them, a colonel half the general's age, had spent the entire drive over trying to explain that hospitals had their own rules, their own order of things, that rank meant nothing past the front doors. He had given up making that point somewhere around the 3rd red light they ran. General Edward Hartley did not stop at the front desk. He walked straight past it. "Where is my son?" he said, not a question, a command dressed up as one. The woman at the desk, a young clerk named Linda Forbes, stood up so fast her chair rolled backward into the wall. "Sir, if you could just—" "Daniel Hartley came in by ambulance 10 minutes ago. Where is he?" "He's being treated, sir. If you'll wait in the—" "I don't wait." Hartley's voice did not rise. It did not need to. It carried the particular weight of a man who had spent 30 years giving orders and having them followed without question. "I want Claire Whitfield. Get her down here now." Linda blinked. "Dr. Whitfield isn't on call tonight, sir." "I don't care whose night it is. She is the best trauma surgeon in this state, and my son is going to have the best. Call her. Call her house. Call her cell. Call whatever you have to call." Linda picked up the phone with shaking hands and dialed the only number she had for Dr. Whitfield, a private line reserved for emergencies exactly like this one. It rang once, twice, a third time, and Linda's eyes flicked up to the general's face, watching it harden with every unanswered ring. A fourth ring, and then a click, and a voice picked up that was not Dr. Whitfield's at all, but a recorded message asking the caller to leave their name and reason for calling. Linda left both. Her voice cracked slightly on the word, emergency. She set the phone down and looked up at the general, bracing herself for whatever came next. "Try again," he said. "Sir, try again." What Linda did not yet know, and what General Hartley did not yet know, was that Dr. Claire Whitfield was already in motion. Her car was already on the interstate, headlights cutting through a thin mist, radio playing low. What none of them knew was that 20 minutes ahead of her, on the very road she needed to take, a truck had jackknifed across 3 lanes and brought everything behind it to a complete stop. Brake lights stretched out ahead of her in a long red ribbon that did not move. Claire drummed her fingers against the wheel, checked her phone, saw 2 missed calls and a voicemail she had not yet had the chance to hear. She tried the number back. It rang and rang into nothing. Somewhere behind her, a line of cars began honking, as if noise alone could clear a jackknifed truck off a closed highway. She closed her eyes for a second, the way she always did before a long surgery, and told herself the same thing she told every nervous family member in every waiting room she had ever stood in. Stay calm. Panic helps no one. She had no way of knowing yet just how true that advice was about to become, or how far away from the operating table she actually was. Back in Bay 3, Daniel Hartley's heart rate climbed on the monitor, a small, steady alarm that none of them liked the sound of. "Pressure's still dropping," the second nurse said. Lang ran a hand through his hair. "Where's Whitfield?" "On her way," Maggie said, though she had no way of knowing that yet. It was the kind of thing you said to keep a room calm, true or not. The door opened and Grace Sutton, the charge nurse, leaned in just long enough to deliver one sentence that changed the temperature of the room. "There's a 4-star general in the lobby and he is not happy." She had worked this floor for 11 years. She had seen angry husbands, angry mothers, angry strangers who blamed the hospital for things the hospital had no power to control. She had never once seen anyone walk through those doors with quite that particular kind of certainty, the certainty of a man who believed, somewhere deep down, that the right amount of pressure could fix anything. Lang's hands stilled over the chart for a moment. Just a moment, but Maggie saw it, the way you see a single missed step on a staircase. Fear had a shape too, and she knew that one just as well as she knew the bruise spreading under her palm. "Focus on him," she said quietly, nodding at Daniel. "Not on the lobby." Lang exhaled and nodded back, steadying himself the way young doctors learn to, by repeating the steps out loud. "Fluids running, blood ordered. We need imaging the second he's stable enough to move." The general's voice carried down the hallway outside the bay, low and clipped, asking the same question over and over to whoever would listen. "Where is the surgeon? Where is Whitfield? Why is no one moving fast enough?" Maggie did not look up from the monitor. She had heard voices like that before, in places far from this hospital, places with dust instead of tile floors, and tents instead of walls. She had learned a long time ago that the loudest voice in the room was rarely the one that mattered most in the next 60 seconds. What mattered was the number on the screen in front of her, falling by 1 point every few minutes, steady as a clock running backward. For just a moment, something old moved behind Maggie's eyes. A different room, a different set of walls, made of canvas instead of plaster. The same particular silence that came right before everything went wrong. She let it pass through her without stopping for it, the way she had trained herself to let things pass, and turned her full attention back to the boy on the table, because he was not a memory. He was a heartbeat she still had a chance to keep going. She glanced at Lang. "If this keeps dropping before Whitfield gets here." "I know," he said, cutting her off, not unkindly. "Just tired, just young. I know what it means." The door swung open again, harder this time, and General Hartley filled the frame of it before anyone could stop him. His eyes went straight to the gurney, straight to his son's face, gray under the fluorescent lights. For 1 full second, the loudest man in the building said nothing at all. Then the monitor screamed. Lang spun toward it. The second nurse froze with a bag of fluid still in her hand. The general took 1 step forward, his mouth opening on a word that never made it out, because in that same second, Maggie Doyle's hands were already moving, already reaching for the tray of supplies beside her, already 2 steps ahead of every other person standing in that room. No one had asked her to do anything yet. She was about to do it anyway. The alarm did not stop. It climbed higher, a thin electronic shriek that filled every corner of Bay 3, and for one terrible breath nobody moved at all. Lang stood frozen with the chart still in his hand. The second nurse stood frozen with the bag of fluid raised halfway to the pole. The general stood frozen in the doorway, finally silent, watching his son's chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven pulls. It was Maggie who broke the stillness. She did not ask permission. She did not look at the general, did not look at Lang, did not look at anyone but the boy on the table and the place beneath his ribs where the bruising had spread furthest. Her hands found the supplies on the tray without her eyes ever leaving the monitor, the same way a pianist finds the right keys without looking down. "Pressure's crashing," she said. "He needs more than fluids." Lang snapped out of it. "We wait for Whitfield." "He doesn't have 40 minutes. I'm not authorized to." "I know what you're authorized to do," Maggie said, and there was no heat in her voice, no panic either, just a flat certainty that cut straight through the noise of the alarm. "I'm telling you what he needs." General Hartley's eyes moved from his son to the nurse standing over him, a woman he had not even registered as a separate person until that exact moment. To him, she had been part of the background, one more pair of hands in green scrubs. Now she was the only person in the room who looked like she knew what was happening. "Who is in charge here?" he said. Nobody answered him. Nobody had time to. Grace Sutton stepped into the doorway behind him, her voice low but firm. "General, I need you to step back into the hallway. That is my son." "I understand that, sir. And right now, the best thing you can do for him is let these people work." For a man used to being obeyed, the request landed like an insult. His jaw tightened. His hand came up, not to strike anyone, simply to gesture, to argue, to insist on the thing he had walked in here insisting on from the start. But Grace did not move from the doorway, and something in her steady, unimpressed expression made him hesitate in a way that nothing else in that hospital had managed to make him hesitate yet. Inside the bay, Lang's mind raced through every protocol he had ever memorized, every case study, every lecture about scope of practice and chain of command, and what happened to careers when nurses acted outside their lane. None of it mattered as much, in that exact second, as the number on the screen. He looked at Maggie. "What do you need?" "Hands," she said. "And someone watching that monitor like his life depends on it, because it does." The second nurse moved first, snapping back into motion, passing equipment without being asked twice. Lang positioned himself at Daniel's side, his earlier hesitation folding itself away under the simple, urgent need to be useful. Maggie's hands worked with a steadiness that did not match the chaos around her. She had done this before, in places where the lighting was worse, and the supplies were fewer, and the stakes were exactly the same as they were now, which was to say, everything. A different room came back to her in pieces, uninvited. Dust instead of tile, a canvas roof instead of fluorescent lights. A different young man on a different table, and her own hands moving too slowly that time, a half-second too slow, a mistake she had spent 3 years trying to outrun. She was not going to be a half-second too slow this time. "Talk to me," Lang said, watching her work. "Internal bleeding's faster than the fluids can keep up with. We need to slow it down until Whitfield can open him up properly. I'm not fixing this. I'm buying time." "And if it doesn't work?" Maggie did not answer that. There was no answer worth saying out loud in a room where the patient could, in theory, still hear every word spoken over him. Out in the hallway, General Hartley paced in a tight line in front of the closed doors, his 2 aides standing a careful distance away, neither of them brave enough to say anything useful. He had commanded soldiers through situations far more dangerous than a hospital corridor, had given orders that sent men into places where the odds were worse than anything happening behind these doors right now. And yet none of that experience had prepared him for the particular helplessness of standing outside a closed door while someone he loved fought for his life on the other side of it, with no rank, no authority, and no weapon that could change the outcome. His phone rang. He answered before the first ring finished. "This is Hartley." It was Claire Whitfield's assistant, relaying a message that had finally made it through. Dr. Whitfield was stuck behind an accident on the interstate. No clear estimate on when traffic would clear. Possibly 20 minutes, possibly longer. She was sorry. She was doing everything she could. 20 minutes, possibly longer. General Hartley closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, the same way Claire herself had done a few miles away on a stopped highway, and when he opened them again, something in his face had changed. The anger was still there, but underneath it, for the first time since he had walked through those front doors, something else had surfaced, something that looked almost like fear. He turned to Grace Sutton. "Who is that nurse?" "The one in there with my son." "Maggie Doyle," Grace said. "What's her background?" Grace hesitated, not because she didn't know, but because she wasn't sure how much of it was hers to share. "She's been with us 2 years. Before that, she served 3 tours overseas, combat medical units. She doesn't talk about it much." Hartley's eyes narrowed slightly, processing that information the way he processed every piece of intelligence that crossed his desk, filing it away for later, even as the immediate crisis pressed down on him harder than anything filed away could matter right now. Colonel Ellery, standing a few steps away, shifted his weight, clearly debating whether to speak. "Sir, if I may, combat medical units don't train people the way regular hospital staff get trained. Whatever she's doing in there, she's seen worse than most surgeons see in a career." "I'm aware of what combat medicine looks like, Colonel." "I know, sir. I just thought it might help to hear it from someone who isn't currently terrified for his son's life." Hartley shot him a look that, on any other night, might have ended the conversation entirely. Tonight it only held for a second before softening, the smallest crack in his composure showing through, noted. Inside the bay, the alarm finally, mercifully, began to slow, not stop, slow. The number on the screen steadied, then climbed 1 single point, then held there, fragile, but holding. Lang exhaled like he had been holding his breath for 10 full minutes. "That's something." "That's not enough," Maggie said, though there was the faintest loosening in her shoulders, the smallest permission to believe the worst moment might have passed. "He still needs surgery, soon." Whitfield stuck. "Then we keep him alive until she's not stuck anymore." The second nurse checked the fluid line, adjusted the flow, glanced at Maggie for confirmation. Maggie nodded, eyes never leaving the monitor, watching the number the way a person watches a flame they are trying to keep from going out in the wind. Behind her, the door opened again. General Hartley stepped inside, slower this time, none of the storm from before, just a man looking at his son's face for confirmation that he was still breathing. "How is he?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice carried no command in it at all. Just a question, just a father. "Stable," Maggie said, "for now." "For how long?" "I don't know." It was not the answer he wanted, it was the only honest one she had. He looked at her properly then, for the first time since he had walked through the hospital doors, and something passed between them that neither one of them named out loud. Recognition, maybe. The particular understanding that exists between two people who have both stood in rooms where the outcome was not guaranteed, and the only thing left to do was the next right thing, over and over, until either the crisis ended or it didn't. "Whitfield's 20 minutes out," he said, "maybe longer." "I heard." Can he last that long? Maggie's eyes flicked to the monitor, to the fragile holding number, to the slow rise and fall of Daniel's chest. She thought of the canvas tent again, the dust, the half-second that had cost her everything once before. She was not going to let this be that story again. "He's going to last that long," she said, and there was nothing soft about the way she said it. It was a promise made the way soldiers make promises, the kind backed up by action instead of comfort. The general nodded once, sharp, the way he nodded at briefings that had finally given him something he could work with. He stepped back into the hallway to let them work, and found his 2 aides waiting there, both of them with the particular stillness of men who did not know what to do with their hands when there was no task to give them. The younger of the 2, a colonel named Frank Ellery, cleared his throat. "Sir, the hospital director is asking if you'd like to wait in a private room upstairs. Coffee, privacy, away from—" "I'm not leaving this floor," Hartley said. "Understood, sir." Ellery had served under Hartley for 6 years. He had seen him calm under artillery fire, calm during congressional hearings, calm in rooms full of men who wanted him to fail. He had never seen him like this. Hands curled loosely at his sides, eyes fixed on a closed door, as if staring hard enough might let him see through it. "You remember Hollow Creek," Hartley said, not looking at Ellery, not really talking to him at all. "Sir?" 2 men. We waited on a medevac that took 40 extra minutes because of weather. I've thought about those 40 minutes more times than I can count. He paused. I don't intend to think about these ones the same way. Ellery said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that. Down the hall, Ryan Cole, the paramedic who had driven Daniel in, leaned against the wall near the vending machines, still in his uniform, still smelling faintly of the road. He had not been asked to stay. He had stayed anyway, the way some first responders do, unable to simply hand a patient off and drive away without knowing how the story ended. He watched General Hartley pace the hallway and felt the particular discomfort of a young man witnessing an old man's fear up close, a fear that had nothing to do with rank or stars or 30 years of command. A few feet away, Linda Forbes manned the front desk phone, fielding a second call from Dr. Whitfield's office, then a third from a hospital administrator wanting updates, then a fourth from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a local news desk that had somehow already heard a general's son was in critical condition. She declined to comment and hung up, hands shaking slightly, wondering how news traveled faster than ambulances. Inside Bay 3, the room had settled into the strange, focused quiet that follows a crisis, narrowly avoided but not yet resolved. Lang checked Daniel's pupils, checked his pulse again, made notes in a chart that would later be read by people far more senior than him, people who would decide whether what happened in this room tonight was heroism or a violation worth investigating. He glanced at Maggie. You've done this before. The exact thing you just did. Once or twice. Where? Maggie did not look up from the monitor. Doesn't matter where. It matters to me. I want to know what I just watched. She considered him for a moment. This young doctor who had frozen for half a second and then unfroze, who had handed her the room without being asked twice, who would carry tonight in his memory the same way she carried certain other nights in hers. You watched someone do the only thing there was to do, she said. That's all it ever is. Not bravery, just math. Either you act or you don't, and only one of those options gives him a chance. That's not nothing. It's not everything either. The second nurse, a steady woman named Patricia Glenn, kept her eyes on the monitor as she worked, double-checking the fluid levels, recording vitals every 2 minutes instead of the usual 5, the way you did when a number's stability could not yet be trusted. He's holding, she said. Barely, but holding. Maggie allowed herself, for one single breath, to imagine the version of tonight where this worked, where Whitfield arrived in time, where Daniel Hartley woke up in a recovery room 3 days from now, annoyed about the scar, and nothing worse. She let the image surface and then put it away again, because hope was a luxury you paid for later, after the work was finished, not during. Out in the corridor, the general's phone buzzed again, a text this time, from Whitfield's assistant. Traffic clearing slowly. 15 more minutes, possibly. He read it twice, then closed his eyes, then opened them, and looked at the closed door of Bay 3 like a man counting down a fuse he could not see. 15 minutes. He had survived longer waits than that in his career. He had stood in command tents while clocks ran down on decisions that would decide whether men lived or died, decisions made by people far away, decisions he had no power to speed up no matter how many times he asked. He had told himself, every single time, that the waiting was the hardest part, harder than the decision itself, harder than the aftermath. He had been wrong every single time. Tonight was proving to be the hardest version of all of it, because for the first time in 30 years, the person whose life hung on someone else's timing was his own son. Inside the bay, the monitor held its fragile rhythm. Patricia recorded another set of numbers. Lang adjusted the angle of the bed, just slightly, the way Maggie had quietly suggested without making it sound like a suggestion. And then, with no warning at all, the number on the screen dropped. Not slowly this time, not the gradual slide they had been fighting for the last 20 minutes. It fell hard, fell fast, a cliff instead of a slope, and every person in that room felt the floor shift under them at exactly the same moment. He's bleeding again, Maggie said, worse than before. Lang's hands moved instantly to the chart, to the supplies, to anything that might slow the fall of the number in front of them. Patricia called out the new reading, and her voice cracked slightly on the second digit. The general, still standing in the doorway where he had been quietly granted permission to stay, gripped the frame of the door hard enough that his knuckles went pale. What's happening? He said. Nobody answered him this time either, not out of disrespect, but because every ounce of attention in that room had narrowed down to a single point, the same way it had the first time the alarm went off. Except this time, there was no 15 minutes of buffer left to work with, no surgeon closing the distance on a clearing highway, no margin at all. Maggie's hands found the tray again, faster this time. The hesitation she might have carried into this exact moment a year ago, long since burned away by everything that had come before tonight. She had run out of time to wait for permission, run out of time to wonder whether this was within her scope, run out of every kind of time except the kind that mattered, which was the kind ticking down on the monitor in front of her. What none of them in that room knew yet was that 15 minutes was about to feel like the longest stretch of time any of them had ever lived through, and that the fragile holding number on the monitor had just become the only thing standing between Daniel Hartley and a door none of them wanted to walk through. There was no more time to weigh options. Maggie's hands moved, quick, certain, practiced in a way that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with muscle memory built over years in places far worse equipped than this one. "Talk to me," Lang said again, his own hands ready, waiting for instruction. "Pressure on the site. Now." He pressed. She worked. Patricia called out numbers in a steady stream, a heartbeat translated into language. 90, 86, 81. Falling like a stone dropped down a well. "Come on," Maggie said, not to anyone in the room, not even to Daniel exactly, to the bleeding itself, as if it might listen. It did not listen. The number kept falling. 78, 73. "Check his breathing," Maggie said. "If the bleed's pushing up against the lung, pressure alone won't be enough." Lang adjusted his grip without letting up, leaning to check the rise and fall of Daniel's chest, counting under his breath. Breathing's shallow but even. Lung sounds clear on both sides. "Good. Keep counting. Tell me the second that changes." Patricia adjusted the angle of the bed another 2 degrees, elevating Daniel's legs slightly, a small trick that brought blood flow back toward the organs that needed it most. It was the kind of detail nobody outside a trauma bay would ever think to notice, the kind of small mechanical adjustment that sometimes mattered more than anything dramatic. 75, Patricia said. "It's not climbing yet."
"Give it time,"
Maggie said, though her voice carried less certainty than her hands did. "Pressure takes a minute to show on the numbers. Don't chase the screen. Trust the work." Behind them, General Hartley took a step forward, the doorway no longer enough distance to hold him back. Grace Sutton put a hand on his arm, not pulling him back this time, just steadying him, the way you steady someone standing too close to a ledge. "Let her work," Grace said quietly. Hartley's jaw worked, his whole body coiled with the particular helplessness of a man who had spent his life solving problems with orders and resources and rank, none of which meant anything in this room. He had nothing to offer. No command could lower a number on a screen. No rank could close a wound. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had absolutely nothing to do but watch. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory surfaced that had nothing to do with the army at all. Daniel, at 8 years old, scraped knee, refusing to cry in front of his father because he had already decided, even that young, that Hartley men did not cry. Hartley had knelt down that day and told him it was all right to cry. That strength wasn't the absence of pain, it was what you did with it. He had not thought about that afternoon in years. He thought about it now, standing in a doorway he had no power to walk through, and found he could not remember if he had ever told his son the same thing twice. Out in the hallway, Ryan Cole had not left his spot by the vending machines. He watched nurses move briskly in and out of the bay, watched the general's aides exchange worried glances, watched Linda Forbes hang up one phone, only to have it ring again immediately. Nobody had to tell him things were bad. He had been doing this job long enough to read a hallway the way other people read a clock. Maggie's mind ran 2 tracks at once. On the surface, her hands worked through the steps, the pressure, the positioning, the careful watch on the line feeding fluid into Daniel's arm. Underneath, a different memory pushed up through the floor of her concentration, uninvited and unwelcome. A different table, a different soldier, 22 years old, calling for his mother in a language she didn't speak fluently, but understood anyway, because pain translates itself. She had been a half-second slow that day. She had told herself for 3 years that the half-second hadn't mattered, that he would have died regardless, that the bleeding had been too severe, too far gone before he ever reached her hands. She had never fully believed her own story. Tonight she was not going to be slow. 80, Patricia called. It's climbing back. 82. Keep pressure, Maggie said. Don't move it. Lang held steady, sweat at his hairline, eyes locked on the readout, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. 84. The room held its breath collectively, the way rooms do when a number becomes the only thing anyone can think about. 86. 89. It was not a fix. Maggie knew that better than anyone in the room. It was a pause, a held breath, borrowed time bought with pressure, and steady hands, and nothing more permanent than that. But borrowed time was exactly what they needed, because somewhere out on the interstate, traffic had finally begun to move, and a car with a trauma surgeon behind the wheel was closing the distance 1 mile at a time. 91, Patricia said, holding. Lang exhaled long and slow, the sound of a man who had aged 5 years in the last 5 minutes. That's the most stable he's been since he came through the door. Maggie did not relax. Not yet. Her hands stayed exactly where they were. Pressure unbroken, eyes on the monitor as if looking away might undo everything she had just bought them. We're not done, she said. We hold this until Whitfield walks through that door. Not before. General Hartley, still standing where Grace had steadied him, watched the nurse he had not even noticed an hour ago hold his son's life together, with nothing but her hands, and a refusal to accept the alternative. Something in his chest, something that had been clenched since the moment his phone rang with the first call about the accident, loosened by 1 single degree. Not relief, not yet, but something close enough to it that he allowed himself for the first time to breathe all the way out. Who taught you to do that, he asked, his voice rough in a way it had not been all night. Maggie didn't look up. Necessity. It was the only answer she had, and it was the truest one. Outside, headlights swept across the ambulance bay as a car pulled in too fast, tires catching the curb, a woman already half out of the driver's seat before the engine had fully stopped. Claire Whitfield had made the last 15 minutes of that drive in what felt like 90 seconds, every red light somehow turning green just as she reached it, every lane somehow clearing exactly when she needed it to. She did not believe in luck. She believed in margins, in the careful math of trauma medicine, and she had spent the entire drive doing that math in her head, calculating how much time the ER team likely had left, calculating how much of it they had probably already lost. She came through the front doors at a near run, white coat over the clothes she had thrown on without thinking, badge swinging loose around her neck. "Where?" she said to the first person who looked at her, and the first person who looked at her happened to be Grace Sutton, already moving to meet her halfway across the lobby. "Bay 3. He's stable. Barely. Who's got him?" "A nurse. Maggie Doyle. She's been holding pressure on an internal bleed for the last 10 minutes. Bought him the time you needed." Claire didn't stop moving, didn't slow down to process that information beyond filing it away the way she filed away every piece of useful intelligence in the seconds before walking into a crisis. "Tell the OR I need a room ready in 5 minutes." Already done. Claire pushed through the doors of Bay 3 and took in the scene in the half-second it took most people to blink. A young man, pale, fragile but breathing. A resident with steady hands and exhausted eyes. A second nurse calling out numbers in a clear, practiced voice. And a third nurse, older than the others, leaning over the patient with both hands pressed flat against his side, eyes locked on the monitor, completely unaware that anyone new had entered the room at all. "I've got him," Claire said. Maggie looked up for the first time in what felt like an hour. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. 2 professionals recognizing each other across a gap neither of them needed to explain. "Internal bleed lower right," Maggie said, voice steady, handing over every detail in the order that mattered most. "Pressure's been holding at 90 since I started. Lost it twice before that. He needs surgery now, not later." "Then let's go," Claire said. Maggie did not move her hands until Claire's were exactly where hers had been, the handoff seamless, practiced, the kind of transition that only happens between people who understand, without needing it spelled out, that the patient's life depends on the gap between one set of hands and the next being as close to nothing as humanly possible. "Got him," Claire said. Only then did Maggie step back. The bed was already moving, Claire walking alongside it, calling out instructions to the team gathering around her in the hallway, an anesthesiologist falling into step, 2 more nurses appearing from somewhere to help guide the bed through the doors toward the operating wing. It happened fast, the way these things always happened once the right person finally arrived, a machine clicking into gear after sitting idle for too long. Lang stood very still in the middle of the now half-empty bay, staring at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. Sweat had soaked through the back of his scrub top. His legs felt unsteady beneath him in a way they never had after any shift before this one. "You all right?" Patricia asked him, already busy stripping the used supplies from the counter, restoring order to a room that had briefly held none. "I think so." He let out a breath that turned into something close to a laugh, the particular laugh of a person who has just survived something and does not yet know what to do with the leftover adrenaline. "I froze. Right at the start. Half a second, maybe less, but I froze." "Everybody freezes the first time," Patricia said. "The good ones unfreeze fast enough that it doesn't matter." She didn't freeze at all. Patricia glanced toward the doorway, where Maggie still stood, hands loose at her sides now, watching the empty hallway where the bed had just disappeared. She doesn't anymore. Doesn't mean she never did. Down the corridor, the operating room doors swung open to receive them, and inside, a team already assembling around the table moved through the practiced choreography of preparing for emergency surgery. Trays of instruments laid out, monitors wheeled into position, lights adjusted overhead. Claire scrubbed in without breaking stride, her mind already 3 steps ahead, running through the same calculations she had been running in her head for the entire drive over, narrowing now from general possibility down to the specific reality in front of her. "Talk to me," she said to the anesthesiologist beside her. "Vitals are stable enough to proceed. Whoever held pressure on this bought him real time." "She did," Claire said, and left it at that, because there would be time later to ask Maggie Doyle exactly how she had done it. Time later to put into a report the kind of thing reports rarely captured well. Right now there was only the work in front of her, and she gave it the same complete attention she gave everything, the same attention that had made her the name everyone in that hospital reached for when nothing else was working. Grace Sutton stood near the nurses' station, watching the operating wing doors from a distance, already turning over in her mind the report she would have to file before her shift ended. What Maggie had done tonight had saved a life. It had also gone well outside the boundaries of what a nurse was authorized to do without a physician's direct order, and Grace knew, the way anyone who had worked hospital administration long enough knew, that saving a life and following protocol were not always the same conversation once the paperwork started. She decided she would write the report honestly and worry about the consequences after Daniel Hartley was out of surgery, not before. Some things deserved to wait their turn. Toward the front of the building, Linda Forbes finally got a quiet moment to breathe, setting the phone down for the first time in what felt like an hour. A second reporter had called, then a third, the story of a general's son apparently too good a headline for any newsroom in the city to ignore. She had given out nothing beyond the standard line about patient privacy, but she understood, watching the lobby doors for any new arrival, that this story was not going to stay contained inside these walls for long. Whatever had happened in Bay 3 tonight, the world outside was already starting to ask questions about it. Back in the now quiet bay, General Hartley stepped aside to let the bed pass, his eyes following his son the entire way down the hallway until the doors of the operating wing swung shut behind him. Then, and only then, did he turn back toward the room they had all just left, toward the nurse still standing there, alone, in the sudden quiet. Maggie was already pulling off her gloves, snapping them into the bin, with the kind of automatic motion that needed no thought behind it. Her hands, so steady minutes before, carried the faintest tremor now, the kind that only ever showed up after the work was finished. "You saved his life," Hartley said. "Dr. Whitfield is saving his life, right now, in an operating room, doing the actual surgery. I bought some time. That's all that was. That's not all that was." Maggie met his eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the silence stretching long enough that Lang, gathering supplies a few feet away, found a reason to step out of the room and give them space he had not been asked to give. "I need to know who you are," Hartley said. "I'm a nurse here. 2 years. That's not what I'm asking." Maggie pulled the last of the used supplies into a bin, buying herself a moment before answering. "Before this I served, combat medical units, 3 tours. Where? Doesn't matter where." It was the same answer she had given Lang an hour earlier, and it carried the same weight now. A door closing politely but firmly. Hartley studied her for a long moment, the way he studied intelligence reports that gave him half a picture and withheld the rest, deciding whether to push for more or let the gap stand. He let it stand. For now. "What rank did you leave at?" he asked instead. Staff Sergeant. With 3 tours and the kind of hands you just showed me, you could have made it further than Staff Sergeant. I wasn't interested in further. Why not? Maggie's jaw tightened, just slightly, the smallest crack in the composure she had held through the entire crisis. Because every promotion I was offered came with more people under my command, and the last time I had people under my command, one of them didn't come home. I decided I was better suited to working with my hands than giving orders with my mouth. Hartley did not respond right away. He had spent 30 years giving orders, had sent men into situations where some of them did not come home, had carried every one of those names with him in ways nobody outside his own head ever saw. He recognized the particular weight behind what she had just said, recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection in an unexpected mirror. What was his name, he asked. The one who didn't come home. Maggie did not answer immediately. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang, and was answered by someone else, the ordinary sounds of a hospital continuing on around them, as if the last hour had not happened at all. Private Okafor, she said finally, 22. I was a half-second too slow getting to him. I've spent 3 years making sure I'm never a half-second too slow again. Tonight you weren't. Tonight I wasn't, she agreed, and something in her shoulders loosened, just barely, the smallest release of a weight she had carried into this hospital, and out of it, every single day for 3 years, without anyone ever asking her to set it down. Hartley nodded slowly, filing that away, the same way he filed away everything that mattered. I lost men too, Hollow Creek, 11 years ago, 2 of them, while we waited on a medevac that took 40 minutes longer than it should have, because of weather nobody could control. I've never stopped thinking about those 40 minutes. I'm sorry. So am I. About your Private Okafor. It was a strange kind of common ground, built on loss instead of anything either of them would have chosen, but it was common ground all the same, and for a moment the 4-star general and the nurse he had not noticed an hour earlier stood in a quiet hospital bay, as 2 people who understood exactly what the other one carried. I want to make something clear, Hartley said, his voice shifting back into the register of command, though gentler now than it had been at the start of the night. Whatever protocol you broke tonight, whatever rules you bent, I will personally make sure none of it costs you anything. I have influence in places that matter for exactly this kind of situation. Maggie shook her head. I don't need you to fix this for me. I'm not asking permission. With respect, General, you don't get to give the orders in this building. Not tonight, and not about this. For the first time since he had stormed through the front doors, something that might have been the beginning of a smile pulled at the corner of Hartley's mouth. You remind me of someone. Who? Myself, 30 years ago, before I learned how convenient it was to let other people fight my battles for me. He looked toward the operating wing doors, still closed, still holding his son somewhere beyond them. I'll wait for word on Daniel. After that, I intend to find out everything about you that you don't want me to find out. Good luck with that. I don't need luck. I have resources. So did I once, Maggie said. Didn't make the hard things any easier. He almost laughed at that, a short exhale through his nose that carried more warmth than the entire night had carried up to that point. He turned and walked toward the waiting area outside the operating wing, where his aides stood ready to fall into step behind him, where the long, uncertain hours of surgery were only just beginning. Time moved strangely after that. Maggie finished her shift on autopilot, checking on other patients, charting vitals, answering questions from worried families in the careful, measured voice she had perfected over years of doing exactly this. Word of what had happened in Bay 3 traveled through the hospital the way these things always did, in whispers between shift changes, in the careful, curious glances of colleagues who had heard a version of the story already exaggerated past recognition. 3 hours later, Claire Whitfield walked out of the operating wing still in her surgical cap, exhaustion written plainly across her face, but carrying with it the particular satisfaction of a surgeon who had finished the work in front of her successfully. General Hartley rose from the waiting room chair he had occupied without moving for the better part of 3 hours. He's stable, Claire said. The surgery went well. We repaired the bleed, and barring complications, he's going to make a full recovery. Hartley's shoulders dropped in a way they had not dropped all night, a release so complete, it looked almost like collapse for half a second, before he caught himself and straightened again. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank the nurse who kept him alive long enough for me to have something left to repair when I got here. Claire pulled off her surgical cap, running a hand through hair flattened by hours under it. I've been doing this work for 20 years. I don't say this lightly. What she did in that bay tonight, under that kind of pressure, without backup, without authorization, without anyone telling her it was the right call, that's not something you teach in nursing school. That's not something you teach anywhere. I know, Hartley said. I was there. Claire studied him for a moment. This man whose reputation for demanding the best had reached even her ears before tonight, and found something in his face she had not expected to find. Not the arrogance she had braced herself for on the drive over. Something closer to humility, hard-won and freshly arrived. Can I see him? Hartley asked. He's in recovery. Groggy, but he should be able to talk soon. 5 minutes, no more, and then we let him rest. Hartley followed her through a set of doors into the recovery wing, where Daniel lay in a bed surrounded by monitors that beeped in a slow, steady rhythm that sounded, for the first time all night, like good news instead of a warning. His eyes fluttered open as his father approached, unfocused at first, then sharpening slowly as recognition set in. Dad, Daniel said, his voice thin and rough. I'm here. What happened? You scared about 10 years off my life. That's what happened. Hartley pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, something he rarely did, something that surprised even him as he did it. You're going to be all right. Daniel's eyes drifted half shut again, exhaustion pulling at him in waves. There was a nurse, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I remember her voice, telling me to hold on. I don't remember her face, just her voice. Her name is Maggie Doyle, Hartley said. She's the reason you're still here to ask me what happened. I want to thank her. You will, when you're stronger. Daniel's eyes closed fully this time, sleep pulling him under before he could say anything else. Hartley sat there a while longer, watching the steady rise and fall of his son's chest, the same rise and fall he had watched with terror only hours earlier, now carrying nothing but relief. When he finally stepped back out into the hallway, he found Maggie there, off shift now, pulling a jacket on over her scrubs, ready to walk out into a night that had started like any other and had turned into something none of them would forget. He's asking about you, Hartley said. He's not asking about me. He's asking about a voice he half remembers from the worst night of his life. There's a difference. Will you come back tomorrow? Let him put a face to the voice? Maggie considered this, weighing it the way she weighed most things, carefully and without rushing toward an easy answer. I work tomorrow. I'll stop by his room if there's time. There will be time, Hartley said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, a far cry from the man who had stormed through the lobby, demanding the best surgeon in the state. I intend to make sure of it. She nodded once and turned to leave, walking the long hallway toward the exit doors, leaving the general standing there with the particular stillness of a man who had walked into a building that night, believing rank and reputation could solve any problem, and walked out of it, understanding, finally, that some of the most important things in the world had nothing to do with either one. 2 days later, Maggie was called into a small office near the administration wing, the kind of office reserved for conversations nobody looked forward to having. Linda Forbes's supervisor, a hospital risk manager named Carol Ennis, sat behind a desk with a folder open in front of her. Grace Sutton's incident report inside it. You're not in trouble, Carol said, before Maggie had even fully sat down. I want to be clear about that from the start. That's not usually how these conversations open. Carol allowed a small, tired smile. No, it isn't. But General Hartley made some calls. So did Dr. Whitfield. Between the two of them, and the outcome of what happened in that bay, the hospital board has decided your actions that night fell under emergency standard of care. No disciplinary action. If anything, there's been discussion of a commendation. Maggie folded her hands in her lap, waiting for the part of the conversation that explained why she had actually been called in. There was always a second part. What I do want to ask you, Carol continued, is whether you've ever considered a different role here, something with more oversight responsibility. Trauma response coordination, that kind of thing. Your background, combined with what we saw 2 nights ago, makes you a strong candidate for something bigger than floor nursing. I've heard versions of that question before, Maggie said, from people in uniforms, not lab coats. My answer hasn't changed. Which is, I'm good at this. The floor. The hands-on work. I don't need a title to be useful. Carol studied her for a moment. The the way people studied a puzzle they suspected they weren't seeing all the pieces of. All right. It's noted. The door stays open if you change your mind. Maggie thanked her and left, walking back out onto the floor where she belonged, and did not think much more about the conversation in the days that followed, certain that the door Carol had mentioned would stay closed by her own choice for as long as she had any say in the matter. What she did not yet know was that General Hartley had no intention of letting that door stay closed forever, and that several weeks from now, a very different kind of crisis would arrive at this hospital to test exactly what kind of person Maggie Doyle truly was, whether she carried a title or not. Before any of that, though, there was one quieter moment still waiting to happen. 3 days after the surgery, Maggie found a few free minutes during her shift and walked down to the recovery floor, the same hallway she had walked countless times in 2 years of working there, though never before with quite this particular feeling sitting in her chest. She knocked lightly on the open door of Daniel Hartley's room. He was sitting up now, color back in his face, a tray of hospital food largely untouched beside him. He looked toward the door, and recognition did not come immediately. It came the way memory often does after trauma, sideways, through sound rather than sight. "You're the voice," he said. "I'm a nurse who was in the room," Maggie said, stepping inside. "Maggie Doyle. My dad told me your name about 100 times. I think he wanted to make sure I wouldn't forget it." Daniel managed a small, tired smile. "I don't remember much. Just somebody telling me to hold on, telling me I wasn't allowed to let go yet. That sounds like something I'd say." "Thank you," he said, and the words carried more weight than such a small phrase usually could, the particular weight of someone who understood exactly how close the alternative had come. "For whatever you did, my dad wouldn't give me the full story, said it wasn't his to tell." "It's not a long story," Maggie said. "Pressure, time, and a little stubbornness. The actual fixing was Dr. Whitfield's work. He said you held things together until she got here. Said if you hadn't, none of the rest of it would have mattered." Maggie did not have a practiced answer for that kind of gratitude, the kind that looked you straight in the eye, instead of sliding past discomfort the way most people's thanks tended to. She settled for the truth, plain and unembellished. "I'm glad you're still here to thank me for it." "Me too." Daniel studied her for a moment, the careful, searching look of someone trying to memorize a face that belonged to a voice he already knew by heart. "My dad doesn't impress easily. You should know that about him. 30 years in the Army, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've heard him talk about someone the way he talked about you the last few days. He doesn't need to be impressed. I was just doing my job. Maybe, but not everyone does their job the way you did yours." Daniel shifted against his pillows, wincing slightly at the pull of stitches still healing beneath the bandages. "He's not going to let this go, you know. Whatever you did that night, he's going to want to do something about it. He's that kind of person. I've gathered that much already." "Just thought you should be warned." Daniel's smile widened, the first real one Maggie had seen from him, exhaustion giving way for a moment to something lighter. "For what it's worth, I hope you let him. He doesn't say thank you often. When he means it, it tends to come with more than words." Maggie did not answer that directly, only nodded and told him to rest, that healing took time, and food trays existed for a reason, even when hospital food gave a person every excuse to ignore them. She left the room a few minutes later, walking back to her station, with something unfamiliar sitting in her chest. Not quite comfortable, not quite unwelcome either. She had no way of knowing, walking away from that room, just how literally Daniel's warning was about to come true. 4 weeks passed before General Hartley walked back through the hospital's front doors, and this time, nobody braced for impact when he did. Linda Forbes recognized him immediately, and offered a small, genuine smile instead of the rigid wariness she had greeted him with the first time. "General Hartley, good to see you under better circumstances." "Much better," he said. "Is Maggie Doyle working today?" "She's on the floor. I'll page her." He waited in the lobby this time instead of storming past it, hands folded behind his back in the easy, patient stance of a man who had learned something about waiting rooms in the past month that 30 years of military service had somehow never taught him. When Maggie came around the corner a few minutes later, she stopped short at the sight of him, surprise crossing her face before she smoothed it back into something more composed. "General." "Edward," he said. "I think we've earned first names by now." "Edward," she repeated, testing the word. "What brings you back?" He held up a folder, The kind of folder that meant paperwork, the kind of paperwork that usually meant decisions had already been made somewhere far above either of their pay grades. "I want to talk to you about something. Do you have a few minutes?" Maggie glanced at the clock on the wall. Did the quick mental math nurses always did regarding exactly how stretched a shift could afford to be, and nodded. 10 minutes. The break room's empty this time of day." They sat across from each other at a small table scarred with years of coffee rings, and Hartley slid the folder across to her without preamble. Inside was a formal letter, military letterhead at the top, a proposal beneath it, that took Maggie a full minute of reading to fully understand. "A civilian trauma response position," she said slowly, "working with combat medical training programs, consulting on field protocols. Built around exactly what you do best," Hartley said. "What I watched you do in that bay 4 weeks ago wasn't luck, and it wasn't just training either. It was instinct sharpened by experience most people in medicine never get close to. There are programs that desperately need someone who's lived both sides of that, the battlefield and the hospital floor. I've spent the last month making calls. This role exists now because I made it exist." Maggie closed the folder slowly, her expression unreadable in the particular way it became when she was working hard to keep it that way. "I told the risk manager here the same thing I'm about to tell you. I'm not interested in leadership roles. Not because I can't do the work, because the last time people were under my command, I lost one of them, and I decided a long time ago that I'd rather save lives with my hands than be responsible for the ones I can't reach in time. This isn't command in the way you're thinking of it. It's still responsibility for outcomes I can't always control. That's the part I walked away from." Hartley leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same careful attention he had given intelligence reports for 30 years. Looking for the gap between what someone said and what they actually meant. "Private Okafor," he said quietly, "you think taking this job means you're agreeing to risk that happening again?" "I know it does. Maggie, you held a dying man together with your bare hands 4 weeks ago, with no authorization, no backup, and a 4-star general breathing down your neck the entire time. You didn't freeze. You didn't wait for permission. That's not someone running from responsibility. That's someone who's been quietly carrying more of it than anyone around her realizes, every single day, without the title to go with it." Maggie did not have an answer ready for that, and for a long moment the break room held nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a cart rolling somewhere down the hall. Before she could find words, her radio crackled at her hip, a dispatch call cutting through the quiet with the particular urgency that every hospital worker learned to recognize instantly. "Multiple casualty incident. A charter bus collision on the interstate. Estimated 12 to 15 patients incoming. All units to the emergency department immediately." Maggie was on her feet before the message finished playing. "That's me," she said, already moving toward the door. Hartley rose too, folder still in hand. "Go. We'll finish this conversation later." She did not answer, already gone, already running down the hallway toward an emergency department that was, in the span of about 90 seconds, about to become a different kind of battlefield entirely. By the time Maggie reached the floor, the department had already begun transforming into the particular organized chaos that mass casualty events demanded. Grace Sutton stood at the center of it, barking out bay assignments, but even her experienced voice carried an edge of strain, the kind that came from a hospital staffed for an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, now facing 15 incoming patients, with injuries ranging from minor to critical, with no warning at all. "We need a triage lead," Grace called out. "Someone needs to be at the door sorting these as they come in, because if we don't sort fast, the critical ones get lost behind the walking wounded." Lang appeared from a side hallway, scrubs already on, face set with the particular calm Maggie had watched him build over the past month, calm that had not existed in him before the night Daniel Hartley came through those doors. "I can take triage." "You've never run mass casualty triage before," Grace said. "No, but I watched someone do something harder than that without flinching once. I figure I can manage sorting patients by severity." Grace hesitated only a second before nodding, trusting the conviction in his voice more than his lack of experience. "Doyle, you're with him. Between the two of you, get these patients sorted before the ambulances start backing up in the bay." Maggie fell into step beside Lang without a word needed between them, the two of them moving toward the ambulance bay doors just as the first vehicles began pulling in, lights flashing red and white against the afternoon sky. What followed was not the single narrow crisis of one young man's internal bleeding. It was something wider and more chaotic, a flood instead of a single wave. Patient after patient wheeled through the doors with injuries that ranged from broken bones to a head wound that needed immediate attention to a teenage girl screaming for her mother in a voice that cracked every heart within earshot. Maggie moved through it the way she had moved through every crisis in her life, narrowing her focus down to the next decision, then the next, then the next, refusing to let the size of the disaster overwhelm the manageable pieces in front of her. She tagged a man with a possible spinal injury for immediate transport, redirected a woman with a broken arm toward the waiting area, caught a child wandering dazed near the entrance, and got him into the arms of a nurse who could check him for injuries he was too shocked to report himself. Lang worked beside her, calling out severity levels in a clear, steady voice that carried none of the hesitation he had shown a month earlier, directing patients toward bays with the kind of confidence that came only from having survived one impossible night and learned, in surviving it, that he was more capable than he had ever given himself credit for. A man in his 50s arrived, clutching his chest, color draining from his face with every passing second, and Maggie recognized the signs before he even reached the doors. Cardiac involvement, possible heart attack triggered by the trauma. Get him straight through. Don't wait for paperwork. Lang waved the gurney past the triage line without hesitation, trusting her call completely, the kind of trust that had not existed between them a month earlier, and now moved between them without either needing to ask for it. A woman arrived sobbing, uninjured herself but separated from her young son somewhere in the confusion of the crash site, and Maggie took 30 precious seconds she did not technically have to spare to kneel down, take the woman's hands, and promise her they would find out where her son had been taken, that someone would call the moment they knew anything. It was not triage, it was not medicine in the strictest sense, it was the other half of the job, the half nobody put on a chart, and Maggie had never once believed it mattered less than the rest. The hours blurred together the way they always did during something this size. Individual moments standing out sharp against a general haze of motion and noise. A teenager with a fractured wrist who would not stop apologizing for crying. An elderly man who insisted, despite a visibly broken leg, that the nurses attend to the young ones first. A driver of the bus itself, walking wounded but devastated, repeating over and over that he didn't understand how it had happened, that the road had simply turned to ice without warning. General Hartley stood near the edge of the chaos, the folder still in his hand, watching the two of them work the same way he had watched Maggie work a month before, except this time there was no panic in his chest, no helpless fear pulling at his attention. There was only the quiet, growing certainty of a man watching exactly the kind of leadership he had been trying to put a title on, already happening in front of him without anyone asking permission for it to happen. It took nearly 2 hours for the department to fully stabilize, the last of the bus accident patients sorted, treated, or transferred. The ambulance bay finally quiet again after the storm that had passed through it. Maggie found herself leaning against the nurse's station afterward, the particular exhaustion that came after sustained crisis settling into her shoulders, the same shakiness that had visited her once before in a different bay, weeks ago, after a different kind of fight. A familiar voice called her name from across the department, and she turned to find Daniel Hartley standing near the entrance, looking healthy and steady on his feet in a way that bore almost no resemblance to the pale, fragile young man she remembered. He had come, he explained, to drop off paperwork for his father, and had walked straight into the tail end of the chaos, staying to help where he could, mostly fetching water and blankets for shaken patients in the waiting area, because it was the only kind of help anyone had let him offer. "You look a lot better than the last time I saw you," Maggie said. "I feel a lot better than the last time you saw me." Daniel smiled, glancing around at the department slowly settling back into order. "This is what you do, every day, not just for me, for all of them. Most days are quieter than this. Somehow I doubt that's entirely true." He looked at her for a moment, something earnest behind the easy humor. "I never really got the chance to thank you properly. The kind of thank you that isn't just words in a hospital bed 3 days after almost dying. You don't owe me anything beyond what you already said. Maybe not. But I wanted you to know I haven't forgotten, and I'm not going to. Whatever my dad's offering you, whatever role he's trying to talk you into, I hope you take it. The world needs more people who do what you did for me, walking around with the title to make it official, if only so other people start listening to them the way they should have been listening all along." Maggie did not have a ready answer for that either, and found herself simply nodding, accepting the thanks the way she had learned, slowly, over the past month, to accept things she would once have brushed aside without a second thought. A few feet away, Grace Sutton pulled Lang aside, her clipboard tucked under one arm, the practiced efficiency of someone who had run this department for over a decade, still humming through her, even after 2 hours of chaos. You ran triage on a mass casualty event, with zero formal training in it, and you didn't lose a single patient who arrived breathing. I'm putting that in your file, and I'm recommending you for the Advanced Trauma Fellowship next cycle. Lang blinked, still catching his breath, sweat-soaked and exhausted in the particular way that came after holding a department together for 2 straight hours. I just did what made sense in the moment. That's what good doctors say right before they become great ones, Grace said, and there was real warmth behind the brisk delivery, the kind of warmth she rarely let show through her usual efficiency. A month ago, you froze for half a second in a crisis. Today, you ran one. That's not nothing, Dr. Lang. Some people spend a whole career without ever closing that gap. Lang looked over at Maggie, who offered him a small nod of acknowledgement, the kind of recognition that meant more to him in that moment than any formal commendation Grace could put in writing. He had watched her work that first impossible night and quietly decided, somewhere in the exhausted hours afterward, that the kind of nurse and the kind of doctor he wanted to become looked a great deal like the steadiness she had shown without ever once raising her voice. Today, for the first time, he felt like he had taken a real step toward becoming that himself. Hartley approached her slowly, the folder still in his hand, slightly worn now from being carried through 2 hours of chaos. You didn't need a title in there either, he said. No, that's exactly my point. You already lead. You've been leading this whole time, with or without the paperwork to back it up. I'm not asking you to become someone you're not. I'm asking you to let the rest of the world catch up to who you already are. Maggie looked toward the now quiet ambulance bay, toward Lang a few feet away helping a still-shaken teenage girl find her way to a phone to call her family, toward the ordinary, exhausted rhythm of a department slowly returning to normal after carrying more than it was built to carry in a single afternoon. If I take this, she said slowly, I want it on my terms. Field consulting, not a desk. Training, not command. I'll teach people what I know. I won't be responsible for sending anyone anywhere they can't choose to go themselves. Those terms can be arranged. And I keep working the floor here, part-time at least. I'm not walking away from this hospital. I wasn't asking you to. Maggie held out her hand, and Hartley shook it, the handshake of 2 people who had started this story as strangers across an impossible gap and ended it as something closer to equals, bound together by a single night neither of them would ever fully stop thinking about. For what it's worth, Hartley said, Daniel's doing well, back to full strength. He asks about you more than you'd probably want to know. Tell him I said to eat his hospital food next time. Hartley laughed, a real laugh this time, the kind that had been entirely absent from him the first night they met. I'll pass that along. He hesitated, folder still loose in his hand, something else clearly sitting unsaid behind his eyes. There's one more thing. I made some calls about your private Okafor, his family. I wanted you to know they received the full honors his service deserved, and I wanted you to know that the men he served beside still talk about him, still remember what kind of soldier he was. You weren't the only one who carried him forward, Maggie. You just carried him the longest. Maggie's throat tightened in a way it had not tightened in 3 years. Not even during the worst of the night Daniel Hartley nearly died in front of her. She did not cry. She had not let herself cry over Okafor in a long time, had folded the grief down into something small and useful instead, fuel for steadier hands the next time someone needed them. But something in her chest shifted, some old weight finally allowed to set down for the first time since a dusty tent on the other side of the world. Thank you, she said, and meant it more completely than she had meant almost anything in longer than she could remember. Don't thank me. You earned whatever peace that brings you. A long time before I ever walked through these doors. He turned to leave, then paused at the edge of the nurse's station, looking back at her one more time. There was no command left in his posture now, none of the demanding certainty that had walked through those doors a month earlier, expecting the world to rearrange itself around his rank. There was only respect, plain and unhidden, the kind a man offers when he has watched someone prove, not once but twice, exactly what they were capable of without ever once being asked. He raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute, the kind reserved for people who had earned it the hard way. Maggie did not salute back. She simply nodded, the small, steady nod of someone who had never needed the gesture to know her own worth, and watched him walk out through the same doors he had stormed through a month before, leaving behind a hospital, a department, and a nurse who had quietly changed the course of more than one life, without ever asking for the credit that came with it. In the weeks that followed, word of what had happened on that bus collision afternoon spread through the hospital, much the way the story of Daniel Hartley's surgery had spread a month earlier, quietly at first, then less quietly, until eventually a local paper ran a short piece about the ER team that had handled a mass casualty event without losing a single life. The article mentioned Lang by name, mentioned Grace Sutton's steady leadership, mentioned the hospital's swift coordinated response. It mentioned Maggie only briefly, a single line near the bottom, exactly the way she would have wanted it. She read the piece once, folded the newspaper closed, and went back to checking on the patient in Bay 4, because headlines had never been the part of this work that mattered to her, and they were not about to start mattering now. 6 months later, Maggie accepted a modified version of the consulting role Hartley had offered, training combat medics and trauma nurses 2 days a month, while keeping the rest of her schedule exactly where she wanted it, on the floor, hands busy, doing the work she had always believed mattered most. She never did move into a corner office. She never wanted one. What she carried instead, quietly, was the particular piece of a person who had finally stopped running from the weight of a name she had once failed to save in time, and had instead built something steady out of the lesson that loss had left behind. Daniel Hartley finished his recovery fully, returned to active duty within the year, and made a habit, whenever his deployments brought him back through the city, of stopping by the hospital to say hello to the nurse, whose voice he still remembered more clearly than her face, from that first impossible night. General Hartley never did learn how to wait patiently in a hospital lobby. Not entirely, but he learned something else instead, something he carried with him into every room he walked into for the rest of his career, a lesson that no amount of rank or command had ever quite managed to teach him before that night. The most important moves in any crisis rarely came from the loudest voice in the room. They came from the steadiest hands, working quietly, exactly when it mattered most. Behind her, the department settled back into its ordinary rhythm, monitors beeping, phones ringing, the steady hum of a place built to catch people when everything else had failed them. Maggie pulled her gloves back on, ready for whatever came through those doors next, because that was the work, and the work, more than any title ever could, was exactly where she belonged,